across the wide steppes of Eurasia. From the misty east, great columns of horsemen charged forward like a raging tempest, scattering clouds of dry grass and spreading terror to all who stood in their path. On the Roman frontier, villagers lifted their eyes to the horizon and saw nothing but swirling dust. Then came the clash of steel and the howl of the wind, and they knew that death was drawing near. It was the moment when an entire continent realized that a new power had risen, and its name was Attila. To Rome, he appeared as the living symbol of divine wrath unleashed upon mankind. Fortified cities trembled and slammed shut their gates. Emperors signed humiliating treaties with shaking hands, while ordinary people knelt in the glow of candlelight, whispering desperate prayers through sleepless nights. But behind this veil of fear, what was the truth? Was Attila truly the monster painted by curses and legends, or was he a formidable leader, a mirror reflecting the fragile decay of an aging Roman Empire? The paradox is this: a man who once shook the world has slowly been forgotten. While the names of Caesar and Alexander still echo through the centuries, Attila lingers like a shadow in Europe's memory. Why is it that a figure who once forced Rome to its knees, who nearly reduced the eternal city to ashes, is not remembered with the weight he deserves? Was it because he left behind no radiant temples, only terror in the eyes of his enemies? Or was it because history was written by those who feared him, who deliberately shaped his image into that of a scourge rather than a man of flesh and bone with ambition and vision? Tonight, we will follow the trail of hooves buried beneath the dust of centuries, back to the 5th century, a time when Europe trembled beneath the riders of the Huns. This is not merely a story of blood and fire, but also a story of power, ambition, and truths hidden beneath the shadow of fear. If we close our eyes and picture the world at the end of the 4th century, Europe appears like a weary and aging body, struggling to move forward against one storm after another. The Roman Empire, once a solid stone stretching from Britannia to Egypt, was now fractured. Its borders, thought to be impenetrable along the Danube and the Rhine, were constantly shaken by the pressure of Germanic tribes. And then, from the distant east, a place few Romans had ever seen, there emerged a strange new force that would alter the destiny of the entire continent. These were the Huns. Their origins remain a mystery to this day. Some scholars believe they were descendants of the Xiongnu, the powerful nomadic confederation that once clashed with Han China in the steppes of Mongolia and Inner Asia. Others argue that the Huns were a newly formed people, born from the fusion of many communities across the vast Eurasian steppe. That steppe, stretching from the Yellow River to the banks of the Danube, was a land where the wind never ceased to blow, where endless herds of horses roamed, and where migrating groups followed the rhythm of their livestock. From this harsh environment arose a different kind of people, masters of the bow, the saddle, and the perpetual motion of a wandering life. In the year 370, Hun horsemen crossed the Volga River. They swiftly crushed the Alans and other nomadic people near the Caucasus steppes and pressed into Gothic lands. The Goths would later recall this encounter as a nightmare. They described the Huns as almost otherworldly creatures with unusual features, deep-set eyes, tanned skin, and a terrifying mastery of horseback riding that seemed to make them one with their saddles from birth. Exaggeration or not, there was no denying that the Huns were an unprecedented foe. The steppe had forged them into mobile warriors who could strike with short, powerful bows while riding at full gallop, moving so quickly that even the disciplined Roman legions could not keep pace. Some modern scholars call the Huns the forerunners of the Mongol cavalry, for for their strategies and tactics foreshadowed what Genghis Khan would later unleash on the world. Their arrival set off a chain reaction. The Goths, driven from their homeland by this new pressure, poured southward to seek refuge within Roman borders. In 376, tens of thousands crossed the Danube, opening a turbulent new chapter for the empire. Only 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, they annihilated the Eastern Roman army and killed Emperor Valens. Though the Huns did not wield the swords in that battle, it was their invisible hand that pushed Europe's history onto a different path. To Rome, the Huns first appeared only as a shadow lurking behind waves of migrants. But soon enough, Hun raiders were seen on the Balkan lands themselves. They fought unlike any enemy Rome had ever known, striking suddenly, unleashing storms of arrows, and vanishing before an army could even deploy. A few thousand cavalry were enough to plunge an entire province into panic. Rome was accustomed to dealing with barbarians who lived in villages and farms, Germanic or Dacian tribes that could be besieged, negotiated with, or assimilated. The Huns were something else. They came from places the Roman map left blank. They needed no stone walls, no fixed farmlands. The entire expanse of the steppe was their roaming homeland. And yet beneath the terror there was an overlooked truth. The Huns were not a chaotic horde, they were a tribal confederation, gradually shaping into a multi-ethnic community. The defeated Alans were absorbed, bringing their skills on horseback. Small Gothic groups were drawn into the Hun orbit, becoming reluctant allies. Even early Slavs, Turkic peoples, and Roman slaves were swept into their ranks. The result was a strange mixture, diverse in language and belief, but bound together by one principle, loyalty to their leader and the sharing of spoils. They had no bureaucracy, no written laws, no fortified capital, but they had flexibility. When needed, they could gather a host of 100,000 warriors. When defeated, they dissolved into small bands, vanishing into the steppe until the time came to reunite. This elasticity made them terrifying, yet also fragile. To the Romans, the Huns were elusive, neither an empire in the classical sense, nor mere nameless tribes. They were becoming something unique, a kind of non-settled empire operating under the laws of the steppe. As the 5th century dawned, the Huns had transformed from a distant shadow into a constant nightmare for Europe. Yet one thing was still missing: a leader strong enough to turn this loose confederation into a true storm. And soon, from this soil, a name would rise: Attila. He would embody the mixture, the fear, and the raw potential of the Huns, and he would become the man who made the world tremble. The Roman sources, which remain our main window into the history of the Huns, record almost nothing about Attila's family, other than the fact that he came from a noble lineage within the Hun Confederation. What we do know is that before his time, supreme authority was held by Rugila, also known as Ruga, and that after Rugila's death, power passed jointly to Attila and his brother Bleda. This detail makes clear that Attila's family did not rise from obscurity. Rather, they belonged to the circle of respected chieftains who carried real weight within the political structure of the steppe. Some modern scholars suggest that his family had already played an important role from the earliest days of the Huns' entry into Europe. It may have been their ancestors who commanded the crossing of the Volga, subdued the Alans, and drove the Gothic peoples southward. On the steppe, where there was no fixed throne or inherited crown, power was preserved through the prestige of battlefield victories, and Attila's lineage was among the few families who had amassed such capital. The details of Attila's childhood lie mostly in shadow. He was born at the dawn of the 5th century, perhaps in the year 406 or 407, though the exact place remains unknown. It might have been the grasslands along the river Tisza, in what is now Hungary, or somewhere near the lower Danube, where the Huns often made their seasonal camps. For a nomadic people, the concept of a permanent homeland was vague at best, and this makes tracing Attila's early years nearly impossible. Yet we can still imagine fragments of his upbringing. A Hun child was placed on horseback almost as soon as he could walk. He learned to shoot a bow, to hunt, to ride for long distances, and to grow strong amid tribal gatherings around the fire, where elders recounted victories and young men listened closely to absorb the lessons of survival. Attila grew up not in marble palaces but in felt tents, among the sound of hooves, and within a life shaped daily by hardship and trial. Among the Huns, leadership was chosen through the consensus of tribal chiefs, rather than through strict hereditary succession, as in Rome. This meant that the son of a leader was not guaranteed to inherit power unless he earned recognition. Attila would have grown up with the awareness that authority on the steppe was never automatically granted. It had to be proven through action. That rule of the game would shape the course of his life to come. When Rugila died, authority passed to his two nephews, Attila and Bleda. This moment was crucial, for it marked the first time Attila's name appeared clearly within the structure of Hun leadership. That the two brothers shared power was not unusual. It reflected the nature of the Hun Confederation, where leadership was often distributed in order to maintain balance among the various tribal groups. It was the stage on which Attila stepped out from the obscurity of his uncertain youth, entering the political game of the wider world, where enemies and allies were no longer distant figures in tales, but real presences looming along the Roman frontier. It was during this period of joint rule that the complex relationship between the Huns and the Eastern Roman Empire first began to take shape. To the south, Constantinople stood proud behind the mighty Theodosian walls, at once magnificent and anxious. The city displayed a wealth and grandeur that dazzled the world, yet behind those stone ramparts lay a constant fear. At any moment, horsemen from the northern steppe might appear. The Huns quickly realized they did not need to breach the walls of Constantinople to force the empire into submission. Fear itself was enough. With fear, they could compel the imperial court to pay in gold, silk, and diplomatic concessions. This was the backdrop for the Treaty of Margus in the year 435, one of the first formal agreements marking relations between these two opposing worlds. Under its terms, the Huns agreed not to cross the frontier or attack the Balkan provinces, and in return Constantinople was obliged to pay them an annual tribute. The sum, about £350 of gold each year, may not sound overwhelming, but its meaning was profound. An empire that had once declared itself master of the world was now forced to recognize the standing of a nomadic confederation as an equal. For Attila, such treaties were sharp political tools. They not only provided material wealth to sustain the Hun alliance, but they also elevated his own authority among the tribes. Every sack of Roman gold handed over was proof of his power. He could compel a mighty empire to open its treasury. This, in turn, strengthened the loyalty of the chieftains and helped Attila preserve cohesion within a confederation that was always at risk of splintering. For Constantinople, however, the treaty was a double-edged sword. Gold could buy peace for a few years, but it also taught the Huns that war was not always necessary. A threat alone could bring the empire to its knees. In this way, the treaty ceased to be a mechanism for stability and instead became fuel for new demands. Thus, the first tribute treaties between the Huns and Constantinople were more than mere diplomatic documents. They marked the beginning of a strange relationship, a Mediterranean superpower, once unrivaled, now bound by fear of a nomadic people, while the Huns learned to turn that fear into a resource for their strength. But history did not end there. As the flow of Roman gold into Hun camps grew heavier, a new question arose. Would dependence on tribute make the Huns complacent, or was it merely a stepping stone for Attila to sharpen his ambition, reaching far beyond treaties and striking directly at the heart of Rome itself? Every encounter between the Huns and the Eastern Roman Empire was like a mirror in which both sides saw themselves more clearly. The Huns looked into it and saw an aging empire, still radiant with glittering walls and overflowing treasuries, but fractured within. The Romans, in turn, looked at the Huns and saw the embodiment of their deepest fears, wildness, mobility, and a power that came from beyond their control. In this reflection, the story of early 5th century Europe came into sharp focus. The Roman Empire, long accustomed to viewing itself as the center of the world, had always defined outsiders with the single word barbarian. The term carried both contempt and a denial of legitimacy. Yet with the Huns, Rome was forced to sign treaties to pay gold and to acknowledge them as equals on the political stage. This was nothing less than a mirror reflecting Rome's own decline. From a giver of laws to the world, it had become a negotiator, pleading for peace. For the Huns, each treaty was another moment of recognition. They realized they did not need grand cities or complex bureaucracies to be taken seriously. With horses, bows, and the fear they spread, they could shake an empire that had once bent the Mediterranean to its will. In this way, the Huns became the symmetrical shadow of Rome, on one side an old order crumbling, on the other a rising force from the steppe. The irony is that the strength of the Huns only magnified Rome's internal weaknesses. The Huns did not create Rome's decline, they simply revealed it. Civil wars, corruption, the division between East and West, and economic crises had already drained the empire from within. When the Huns appeared, they were like wind fanning a smouldering ember into open flame. In this sense, the Huns were not merely enemies, they were the mirror that forced Rome to confront its own wounds. Here, the reflection deepens. Rome, with all its gold, palaces, and rituals, found itself increasingly bound by them like chains. The Huns, though poor in comparison, possessed flexibility and an unshakable will. On one side stood a power grown old, on the other, raw energy bursting with vitality. And in that confrontation, advantage slowly drifted toward the newcomers, stepping into history. As the mirror between the Huns and Rome grew sharper, Attila decided to test the limits of treaties with action. For him, the gold paid by Constantinople was the lifeblood of the Confederation, but spoils were only half the story. The other half was prestige. And prestige, for a steppe leader, could not be purchased with bags of imperial gold alone. It had to be earned in the smoke and fire of the battlefield. For this reason, during the 440s, the hooves of the Huns thundered through the Balkans, turning Thrace, Moesia, and the border cities into witnesses of a storm. In the year 441, while Constantinople was preoccupied with the Vandals in the Mediterranean, Attila and his brother Bleda seized their chance. They crossed the Danube and pressed deep into the Balkans. River towns such as Viminatium, in what is now Serbia, fell quickly. The Huns left behind little but ashes, and that alone carried a message. No frontier wall could stop them. The campaigns of 442 and 443 followed, even more devastating. This time the Huns pushed as far as Serdica, modern Sofia, Philippopolis, now Plovdiv, and even advanced to the gates of Constantinople itself. The Eastern Romans were forced into a new treaty, raising the annual tribute to 2,100 pounds of gold, 6 times the amount agreed in the Treaty of Margus only 8 years before. That vast sum stood as undeniable proof of the empire's helplessness. The campaigns inflicted more than material damage, they left a wound upon the spirit. Thrace and Moesia had long been the shield of Constantinople. For centuries they served as a buffer against the pressure from the north. Now that shield had been pierced, and for the first time the people of Constantinople felt their capital, despite the mighty Theodosian walls, was no longer untouchable. One mistake could turn the city into a sea of flames. Equally striking was the way the Huns waged war. They did not always resort to blind plunder. At times their approach was calculated. Some cities were spared if they opened their gates and paid tribute. Others were ravaged as an example. Attila seemed to understand that war was not only about fighting and winning, it was also about sending messages. Every ruined city was a reminder to Constantinople. Peace was never permanent, and its price would only rise. The Steppe and the Balkans thus became bound together in a rhythm of war. Each summer, Hun horsemen swept down, sowed fear, and in the winter withdrew to the steppe, carrying spoils and tales of Rome brought to its knees. For the people of Thrace and Moesia, the memory became an obsession. They knew that whenever dust rose on the northern horizon, it was not a storm of nature, but a sign of disaster about to fall. During these years, Attila was not yet the destroyer of all Europe, but he had become the constant dread of Constantinople. And the most terrifying truth of all was this: the Romans knew they could not destroy him. They could only pay him, and with every sack of gold that flowed into Hun hands, the pride of an empire ebbed further away. In the early 430s, the image of two brothers, Bleda and Attila, ruling the Huns together, defined the political face of the Steppe Confederation. They were seen as twin leaders, Bleda quieter, more inclined toward internal matters, and Attila more prominent as a commander in war and diplomacy. This balance seemed to guarantee stability, allowing the Huns to maintain their strength in dealings with Constantinople. But like every power-sharing arrangement on the steppe, such balance could never last forever. The Roman sources tell us very little about Bleda, mentioning him only as a shadow beside Attila. Yet this very obscurity has led many scholars to speculate: was Bleda truly weak, or was he simply forgotten by history because Attila's brilliance outshone him? Whatever the case, around the year 445, Bleda abruptly vanished from the records. Roman historians hinted that Attila murdered his brother to become sole ruler. There is no concrete evidence, but the coincidence between Bleda's disappearance and Attila's unstoppable rise has made this the widely accepted belief. If Attila did indeed take his brother's life, it would not have been unusual in the world of the steppe. There, power was not easily shared. A vast confederation like the Huns could only endure under an absolute leader, one strong enough to silence disputes and clever enough to keep the tribes loyal. The presence of two rulers, however stable it looked from the outside, always carried the risk of division. Perhaps Attila understood that to prepare for greater ambitions, the Hun confederation needed a single center of power. The death of Bleda was thus a turning point. From this moment onward, there was no one to share authority with Attila. He became the sole face of the Huns, the man who received ambassadors, signed treaties, led armies, and distributed the spoils of war. That concentration of power made him appear almost imperial in the eyes of both allies and enemies. For the tribal chieftains, the message was unmistakable. There was now only one path forward under Attila. But this centralization of power was not only political, it also shaped Attila's style of leadership. Where once he had to maintain balance with Bleda, now he could impose his will without negotiation. He grew more decisive, more daring, and more ruthless when the situation required it. Yet his ruthlessness, if we may call it that, was never separate from calculation. Attila did not remove his brother merely to satisfy personal ambition. He did so, if indeed he was responsible, because he understood that a multi-ethnic confederation could not long survive under divided leadership. Only a single ruler could enforce discipline and fully exploit the fear the Huns had already sown across Europe. Once power was fully concentrated in his hands, Attila turned his gaze westward. If Constantinople, with its towering walls, could hold back the hooves of the Huns, the Western Roman Empire appeared instead as a weakened beast, trembling under a flood of threats. By this time, the western half of the empire was already frail. The capital had shifted from Rome to Ravenna. Germanic generals pulled the strings of the court, and the population lived in fear of endless migrations. In that setting, Gaul, modern-day France, emerged as the perfect target for Attila's grand campaign. In the year 451, Attila assembled a massive army. Some sources claim it numbered in the tens of thousands, others in the hundreds of thousands. This was not only a Hun force, but a great coalition. Alan cavalry, Ostrogoth infantry, and many Germanic groups joined under his banner. Attila knew how to turn the steppe into a rallying cry for those eager for plunder. At the mere wave of his hand, tribes from Eastern Europe to the Danube poured into his ranks like streams feeding a mighty river. Crossing the Rhine, the Hun armies swept through northern Gaul like a storm. Wealthy cities such as Metz, Reims, and Strasbourg collapsed in flames. Chroniclers wrote that Metz was burned on Easter Day, its churches and homes consumed by fire. Elsewhere, terrified residents fled, leaving towns deserted under the shadow of Hun horsemen, their presence a grim warning. But Attila did not come only to plunder. He set his sights on a larger prize, Orléans. Positioned at the center of Gaul's network of roads, the city was considered the strategic key to controlling the region. If Attila could capture Orléans, he could split the forces of Rome and the Visigoths, then open the road deeper into Gaul, perhaps even toward the Iberian Peninsula. On the other side, the Western Roman Empire, under the command of General Aetius, one of the last great Roman commanders, was forced to muster every shred of strength that remained. Aetius, who had once lived as a hostage among the Huns and understood their tactics well, knew there was only one way to ally with former enemies. He persuaded the Visigoths, newly settled in southwestern Gaul, to stand with Rome. It was a fragile alliance, but in that moment of crisis, it became the only wall against Attila. Thus, in the summer of 451, the two powers moved toward an inevitable clash. Before the great battle of the Catalonian fields, Orléans became the focal point. The Huns pressed the city, and its gates seemed ready to fall. But according to legend, the city's bishop, later remembered as Saint Aurelian, prayed tirelessly, strengthening the resolve of the people. When the combined forces of Aetius and the Visigoths arrived in time, Attila was forced to withdraw, failing to capture Orléans. Although thwarted at Orléans, the campaign in Gaul left behind a trail of terror. In those years, the land of modern France burned in the flames of war. Villages lay in ruins, populations scattered, and the memory of Hun riders became etched into folklore as a collective nightmare. People said that where the hooves of their horses passed, nothing grew again. A mythic exaggeration, but one that reflected the fear the Huns carved into the mind of Europe. What made this campaign particularly striking was the fusion of military force and psychological warfare. Attila fought not only with sword and spear, but also with his reputation. The dread of the Scourge of God spread long before his army even appeared. Many cities surrendered without resistance, opening their gates simply at the rumor of his approach. In a world where news traveled by word of mouth, the name of Attila itself was an invisible army. In June of 451, after being halted at Orléans, Attila withdrew his army to the plains of Catalogne near modern-day Châlons-en-Champagne in northeastern France. Here stretched vast open fields with no fortresses to shield them, only the endless sky and the northern winds. It was the perfect battlefield for a colossal confrontation, one of the most fateful clashes of the 5th century, where it seemed all of Europe held its breath. Attila commanded a vast coalition, his battle-hardened Hun cavalry, Ostrogoth warriors, Alans, Gepids, and many other Germanic allies. Ancient sources vary wildly in their numbers, some claiming hundreds of thousands, but even if exaggerated, the scale itself testified to his terrifying power. Opposite him stood the forces of the Roman general Flavius Aetius, who had once lived as a hostage in the camps of the Huns and understood their steppe tactics, alongside the Visigoths under King Theodoric and other allied tribes. The battle was more than a clash of armies, it was the collision of two worlds. On one side, the rising might of the nomads, on the other, the remnants of Rome, straining to stand through a fragile alliance. All was balanced on a knife's edge, and its outcome would shape the destiny of Western Europe. It is said that on the night before the battle, Attila gazed into the starry sky and was troubled by an omen of doom. Perhaps he sensed that the coming day would be unlike any campaign before. Yet retreat without a fight was unthinkable. He resolved to commit everything. At dawn, the two armies deployed across the wide plain. The Huns held the higher ground, a vital tactical advantage. Their cavalry was poised to strike, while the Roman-Visigoth alliance braced to hold their lines. The signal horns blared, and waves of men and horses collided, shaking the earth beneath the thunder of hooves. The struggle raged throughout the day, so bloody and chaotic that later historians could only describe it in near-mythic terms. Jordanes wrote that rivers of blood flowed until the entire field was drowned in red. In the midst of the carnage, King Theodoric of the Visigoths fell, thrown from his horse and trampled to death. Yet his death did not break his people. Instead, his son Thorismund led a furious counterattack, driving back a wing of the Hun army. Seeing his forces falter, Attila withdrew to his camp, where he arranged his wagons in a defensive circle. The Romans and Visigoths encircled him, seemingly holding victory in their grasp. Legend tells that Attila prepared a great funeral pyre within the camp, ready to burn himself along with all the spoils rather than be taken. It was an extreme vision, but it revealed the resolve of a steppe warlord. Alive, he would be a conqueror; dead, an unbroken symbol. Yet Aetius did not press the advantage. Perhaps he feared that the complete destruction of the Huns would leave the Visigoths too powerful for Rome to control. Or perhaps he knew his men were exhausted, unable to continue the fight. Whatever the reason, Attila was allowed to withdraw, leading the remnants of his army back to the steppe. The Battle of the Catalonian Fields ended without an absolute victor. But in Europe's memory, it became Attila's first great setback. The man who had seemed invincible had been stopped. For the Western Roman Empire, it was one of its last moments of fleeting glory, a spark of triumph before its light faded. For the Visigoths, it was a sign of their growing strength, heralding the age when they would step into Rome's place as masters of the West. Stopped at the Catalonian fields, Attila stepped back, but only to gather strength for a new thrust to the south. That setback did not cause him to retreat into caution. It only sharpened his resolve to prove that his renown remained untouched. If Gaul was for the moment beyond his reach, then Italy, the last heart of the Western Roman Empire, became his next target. By then, the western half was so weakened it could hardly resist. And so, in 452, the hooves of the Huns thundered across the Alps, carrying the final storm down upon the Italian peninsula. The march began in the north as Attila swept across the Po Valley. The first cities collapsed with scarcely any resistance. Aquileia, one of the most important cities in northeastern Italy, became the first major target. It resisted fiercely for weeks, but at last it fell. According to tradition, Attila, enraged by its long defiance, ordered the city to be razed. Aquileia was flattened, reduced to rubble. Its destruction was so complete that, for centuries after, Italians said that even the birds could find no place to perch where the city had once stood. After Aquileia, other cities fell in quick succession: Verona, Vicenza, Padua. The power of the Huns lay not only in their swords, but in the terror that ran ahead of them. As word of Aquileia's fate spread, many towns simply opened their gates, knowing resistance meant annihilation. Villages emptied, populations fled southward, forming vast streams of refugees. From these desperate migrations, people began to settle in the Venetian marshes, which over time grew into the famous city of Venice, a strange, indirect legacy of Attila's invasion. Driving deeper into the peninsula, Attila was like a whirlwind tearing through all in his path. Yet his ultimate goal was not mere plunder. He intended to force the Western Roman Empire into total submission, as he had once done with Constantinople. With his powerful army, he had the strength to march directly on Rome itself. The only question was whether the Eternal City still had the will to resist. At that moment, the West was utterly feeble. Emperor Valentinian III was a pale figurehead, while real authority lay in the hands of General Aetius. But after Catalaunian, Aetius could not easily rebuild his forces, especially as the Germanic allies had been grievously weakened. Italy had little left but its ancient walls and its despair. In this desperate situation, a special delegation was sent to meet Attila. At its head was Pope Leo I, one of the most influential figures of the age. The image of the Pope riding out to the banks of the Po River to confront the mightiest man in Europe became legendary. No one knows exactly what was said in that meeting, for the accounts are cloaked in myth. Some claimed Leo's wise words persuaded Attila by stressing the futility of destroying Rome. Others told that Attila saw a vision, St. Peter and St. Paul appearing beside the Pope, terrifying him into withdrawal. Reality was likely harsher and more practical. Roman sources such as Priscus and Prospatero made no mention of miracles. Instead, they pointed to exhaustion in the Hun army after months of campaigning, disease spreading in the camps, dwindling supplies, and news that Eastern Roman Emperor Marcian was preparing to send forces across the Danube to threaten Attila's rear. In this light, the meeting with Leo offered Attila an honorable excuse to withdraw without appearing defeated. The outcome was the same. He did not march on Rome. The city, once again, was spared annihilation by a hair's breadth. The image of Attila halting before the gates of Rome became one of Europe's most haunting memories, like a sigh of relief after a nightmare. Rome had already been sacked by the Visigoths in 410, and now it had come to the brink again. But instead of fire, the city witnessed a miracle of politics and diplomacy. That moment deepened the legend of Attila, the man who could terrify Rome, yet was rational enough to stop. Still, Leo's courage cannot be denied. He placed himself in danger, used words of persuasion, and invoked both the futility of destruction and the divine judgment awaiting those who overstepped. In that fragile moment, the Pope's voice became a thread of salvation. The event left a permanent mark on Christian memory. As the empire's political and military power withered, the papacy emerged as a spiritual anchor. For the Huns, the meeting preserved Attila's dignity. He withdrew not as a defeated man, but as one who had heeded the counsel of God's representative. For history, this was the place where harsh reality fused with myth, retold for centuries afterward. It is no coincidence that during the Renaissance, Raphael painted his famous fresco in the Vatican, Pope Leo raising his hand to stop Attila, while Saints Peter and Paul gleamed above with swords drawn. Though not historical truth, the painting captured how Europe chose to remember the moment, not merely as a political arrangement, but as Christianity's spiritual triumph over the barbarian darkness. From then on, in art and folklore, Attila was draped in religious meaning, not only a conqueror, but an instrument of divine will, permitted to unleash fear, yet bound by higher command. And yet, for all the drama of the negotiation, one truth remained. Attila was still there. The Hun Confederation remained formidable. Europe had not yet escaped the shadow of the Steppe. Questions lingered the moment he withdrew from Italy. Was this the beginning of restraint, or only a tactical pause before the storm returned? At precisely this point of uncertainty, Europe began to call Attila by a name that transcended mere humanity. Flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. What is striking about this title is that it did not come from Attila himself. He never called himself the Scourge of God. The name was born from the fear of his enemies, nurtured by Roman historians and Christian clergy. And yet by doing so, they gave him an almost supernatural status. A destroyer can be hated, but a tool of God is both terrifying and difficult to resist, for who would dare oppose the will of the Almighty? Among the people, the name spread quickly, shaping a layer of collective memory. Farmers, watching their villages burn and their livestock taken, whispered that it was the whip of God. Priests, preaching in their churches, invoked Attila as proof that mankind must live righteously, or else the Lord would strike again with another scourge. In this telling, Attila ceased to be merely a historical figure. He became a moral lesson, a living parable for the community. The power of this title lay in how it reflected reality while also obscuring it. In truth, Attila and the Huns had strategies, politics, and diplomacy. They were not mindless killers. But once he was labeled the Scourge of God, all of that was overshadowed. What remained was only the image of a colossal lash descending upon Europe. This helps explain why centuries later, even when memories of the Huns had faded, the name of Attila still carried the weight of sacred destruction. Remarkably, Attila himself, though he never claimed the title, knew how to use it. He did not deny it when others spoke of him that way. Instead, during negotiations, he maintained a calm, cold silence, allowing that silence to be interpreted as confirmation. A conqueror could be challenged, but a tool of God inspired a fear beyond the reach of human defiance. On a broader level, the title Scourge of God revealed the spiritual crisis of Rome. An empire that once saw itself as the center of civilization, now facing repeated defeats, sought comfort in religious explanations. If Attila was merely a nomadic chieftain, Rome's helplessness would appear humiliating. But if he was God's instrument, then their failures were not due to human weakness, but divine will. In that way, the title served as both humiliation and self-justification. Through this lens, Attila became more than himself. He was the embodiment of divine wrath, a reminder of the cycles of history that no empire could escape. And in Europe's memory, that carried more weight than any single battle or treaty. People could forget the details of the Treaty of Margus or fail to recall exactly where the Catalonian fields lay, but they never forgot that there had once been a man, known as the Scourge of God, who left a continent haunted. Thus, when we look at Attila through this title, one truth stands out. History does not remember leaders solely by their actions, but also by the meanings communities attach to them. Attila endures in collective memory, not just as the ruler of the Huns, but as the embodiment of punishment, a reminder that every civilization, no matter how radiant, may one day feel the sudden lash of fate. From here, the story shifts. It is no longer only about battles or treaties. It turns to a deeper level, how Attila ruled, how he organized power, and how he maintained order in a vast steppe empire. For to become the Scourge of God, he required not only military might, but also a system strong enough to turn fear into lasting reality. To understand why Attila was able to spread terror across Europe for decades, we cannot look only at his personal skill or the ferocity of Hun cavalry. Behind those galloping hooves stood an entire structure of power, its own order, flexible, yet never chaotic, rooted in steppe traditions and transformed by Attila into a political weapon. It was a nomadic empire without stone fortresses or written laws, yet so effective that it could threaten Rome itself. At its heart was the army. The Hun military was a rare engine of mobility, capable of covering hundreds of miles in days, sustained by tens of thousands of horses raised on the steppe. Every Hun warrior was a natural-born horseman. They could shoot arrows with deadly precision from the saddle, twist their bodies to fire backward in feigned retreat, then suddenly turn and counter-attack. These tactics stunned Roman legions whose heavy formations were unprepared for such fluid warfare. But the Huns did not rely solely on their own. Attila drew allies and vassals into his ranks, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, even early Slavic groups. Some provided infantry, others siege engineers, while captured Roman specialists were forced to build machines to storm fortifications. The result was a multi-ethnic host, held together by the prestige of Attila and the spoils he distributed. Law among the Huns was not carved into stone like Rome's codex, but that did not make it any less powerful. On the steppe, law lived in tradition, in oaths, and in the judgment of the ruler. Attila was both judge and embodiment of justice. Roman envoys described him seated in silence within his tent, hearing disputes before giving short, decisive rulings, commands no one dared defy. For the Huns, fairness was not measured in written statutes, but in the authority of the leader. Attila thus became living law, fragile because it depended on one man's character, yet stronger than any throne because no parchment limited him, only the fear and respect of his followers. A pressing question arises: how could a nomadic society without large-scale farming sustain such a vast confederation? The answer lay in tribute and the taxation of plunder. After each campaign, gold, silk, and slaves piled high then were distributed among the tribes according to Attila's decree. Loyal and brave clans received more, those who hesitated or betrayed received less or nothing at all. In addition, treaties with Rome became a treasury in themselves. Constantinople was forced at times to pay thousands of pounds of gold annually to buy peace. Attila divided this wealth among the chieftains, ensuring loyalty while proving that following him was the only road to riches. In a sense, Rome was financing its own destroyer. The structure of Hun rule reflected the spirit of the steppe. There was no fixed capital, but there was a moving center: Attila's camp. This camp was palace, court, and assembly hall all in one, where tribal councils gathered for feasts and political rituals. Beneath Attila stood a network of tribal leaders who were both generals and community heads. They governed their own people but left all major decisions — war, peace, the division of spoils, to Attila. To secure their loyalty, he used a system of hostages. Tribal chiefs sent their sons to his camp, both as guarantees and as a way of weaving them into the Hun elite. Roman or Germanic noble hostages were also held, serving both as bargaining tools and as windows through which Attila learned about the culture of his adversaries. Military power gave Attila the means to spread fear, but to maintain his position over the long term, he relied on more than swords. In the turbulent world of the 5th century, where Rome was in decline and Germanic tribes were constantly rising, diplomacy became a battlefield no less important than war. And here Attila proved himself not only a horseman of the steppe, but also a shrewd negotiator, able to wield both fear and wisdom to achieve his goals. In his dealings with Rome, Attila displayed this talent repeatedly. He understood that, weakened though it was, the empire still possessed immense treasuries and a sophisticated diplomatic system. Rather than destroying it outright, he chose to exploit it. Treaties with Constantinople and Ravenna were not simply the result of military pressure. They were also the fruit of carefully managed negotiation. Attila knew when to be unyielding, such as when demanding that tribute be doubled, and when to be flexible, such as when agreeing to withdraw his forces in exchange for even greater sums of gold. But Attila's diplomacy extended beyond Rome. He skillfully managed relations with the Germanic kingdoms, who could be both enemies and allies. The Ostrogoths, for instance, once resisted the Huns, but under Attila they became loyal vassals. He knew how to reward them with spoils, grant their leaders places in the Hun council, and above all convince them that loyalty would bring more reward than resistance. With the Gepids, Alans, and Heruli, he applied the same mixture of threat and generosity, punishment and reward. One striking example was his handling of the Franks. When one branch of the Franks hesitated between alliance with Rome or with the Huns, Attila moved swiftly, supporting a claimant to their throne who favored his cause. In doing so, he turned their internal disputes into his own advantage without firing a single arrow. Here, diplomacy was not an afterthought, but a weapon as sharp as any blade, sometimes more effective than an army. What made Attila's diplomacy unique was that he never separated it from war. Every treaty was signed in the shadow of a raid that had just occurred, or the threat of one about to begin. For him, negotiation and attack were two faces of the same strategy. Documents might be signed, but in the minds of his counterparts, the echo of Hun hooves never stopped thundering. This fusion of war and diplomacy ensured that no one ever underestimated him. They knew that behind his measured words stood an army ready to act. Compared with Roman emperors, Attila lacked a vast bureaucracy or hundreds of trained envoys, but he compensated with the concentration of authority in his own person. Every major decision came from him directly, and his very presence was his greatest diplomatic weapon. When Rome sent envoys to meet him, they did not merely face a ruler, they faced the living symbol of an entire confederation. Viewed from a wider perspective, diplomacy allowed Attila to be more than a raider. It made him a ruler in the truest sense, someone who knew when to wield the lash and when to extend his hand. The title Scourge of God may be tied to destruction, but behind it lay a keen political mind, one that understood how to harness fear and turn it into lasting power. In Attila's hands, diplomacy did not end at the battlefield or the negotiating table. It seeped into personal lives, where choices that seemed private became pieces on the larger board of power. On the steppe, marriage was never merely a private matter of family. It was a political instrument, an invisible cord binding tribes together, forging alliances or dissolving hostilities. Attila, with his natural shrewdness, understood this better than anyone. For that reason, his marriages, along with carefully arranged personal relationships, became an essential part of how he consolidated power and extended influence. In Hun and many other nomadic traditions, a leader often had multiple wives, each union reflecting a political agreement. Attila was no exception. He is known to have had many wives and concubines, most of them daughters of tribal chieftains within his confederation. Each marriage was like an unwritten treaty. The daughter entered Attila's household, her father became an ally, and the tribe was tied more closely to the center of power. In this way, Attila secured loyalty while weaving kinship ties into bonds that were difficult to break. A telling example was his marriage to daughters of Ostrogothic and Alan leaders. These unions not only brought him the support of skilled warriors, but also reduced the risk of rebellion. When their daughters and grandchildren lived within Attila's camp, such chiefs found it far harder to turn against him. Instead of relying solely on violence to enforce obedience, Attila used marriage to transform allies into family. Yet one story stands apart from the politics of the steppe, the case of Princess Honoria, sister of Western Emperor Valentinian III. Forced into marriage with a nobleman she did not love, Honoria sent Attila a desperate plea for rescue, along with her ring. Attila seized upon it as a proposal of marriage. Holding the ring, he declared his right to half of the Western Roman Empire, her dowry, as he interpreted it. What began as a personal drama within the Roman court became, in Attila's hands, a daring political move. He turned Honoria's plea into a banner under which he justified his campaigns against the West. Ravenna and Rome, of course, refused to recognize such a claim, but Honoria could not undo her act. For years afterward, Attila wielded the story as a political weapon, using one woman's desperation as leverage for continental ambition. A single ring and a forbidden love had been transformed into a justification for war. What is striking, however, is that Attila did not allow private indulgence to dominate his rule. Though he had many wives and consorts, he did not sink into luxury as Roman emperors often did. Envoys described him eating simply, even at grand feasts, while gold and silver vessels were set before his wives and chieftains. This reveals that for Attila, marriage was not about personal pleasure. It was a tool of politics, a means of sustaining and projecting power. From another angle, his marriages show how he could turn seemingly peripheral circumstances into political capital. A Roman princess trapped in a forced marriage, a Germanic chieftain seeking peace, a tribe desiring honor, all became pieces on his chessboard. In Attila's hands, marriage was not private obligation, but part of a larger strategy of governance. Thus, when we look at Attila's marriages, we see not merely a man with many wives, but a ruler who knew how to transform personal ties into levers of power. That is why, even without drawing a sword, Attila could expand his influence through bonds of marriage, bonds soft in form but no less binding than chains of iron. If we see Attila only through the Roman lens, he appears as a storm of destruction, and the Huns as nothing more than a bloodthirsty horde. But stepping inside the world of the Hun camp reveals another reality. Here was a rhythm of life, a set of customs, and a cultural order shaped by the steppe. The people whom Rome called barbarians in fact lived within a structure of their own, a culture both harsh and deeply symbolic, where every moment, from feasts to marriages to funerals, expressed their views of power and fate. The Hun camp was unlike a Roman city with stone walls and public squares. It was a constellation of tents, usually pitched on wide plains beside rivers. Each tribe had its own section, while at the center stood Attila's tent, both his residence and his court, where he received envoys and judged disputes. Roman envoys described what they saw: hundreds of hide tents, horses tethered all around, smoke rising from fires, and within it all, a surprising sense of order. It was not the chaos of wanderers, but a kind of mobile city, alive, disciplined, able to vanish in a day and reappear elsewhere the next. Feasting played a central role in this world. It was not merely about eating and drinking, it was a political ritual where Attila displayed his authority. Witnesses noted that at such banquets the Hun leader did not sit on a carved throne or drink from jeweled cups. Instead, he sat on a plain wooden chair and drank from a simple goblet, while his chiefs and guests dined from gold and silver. The contrast only heightened his prestige. Respect came not from displays of luxury, but from restraint, calm, and self-control, as if he stood above earthly indulgence. Religion and ritual also bound the community together. The Huns worshipped many deities most tied to nature, the sun, war, and fire. They looked for omens in dreams, in the movements of stars, and in the running of their herds. Shamans served as intermediaries with the spirit world, conducting sacrifices before battle. Within this atmosphere, war was not just politics but a sacred mission, sanctioned by divine will. Perhaps the most striking element of Hun culture lay in their funerary rites. The burial of a Hun leader was not a simple interment, but a ritual both mournful and grand. Sources recount that when a chieftain died, a secret ceremony was held. The body was placed in a wooden coffin, along with weapons, horses, and treasures. Every trace of the burial was then erased, so no enemy could ever find and desecrate the grave. Death, for the Huns, was not an end, but a passage into another world, where the warrior would continue his life with steeds, swords, and gold, just as in this one. Thus, the world within the Hun camp emerges as both familiar and strange. Familiar because there were families, feasts, faith, and love, elements found in every human community. Strange because all of it was wrapped in the hardness of the steppe, a culture that revered strength, honored the gods, and viewed death as inseparable from life. These elements formed the spiritual foundation of the Huns, sustaining them until, under Attila's hand, they rose into an empire that haunted all of Europe. As with every steppe empire, within its brilliance lay the shadow of fate. A realm not built upon walls of stone, but upon the force of a single man's authority, would always be vulnerable to the most unexpected moment. And so it was that, just as Attila reached the height of his power, when it seemed no enemy could defeat him, the blow fell. Not on the battlefield, but on his wedding night, amid wine, music, and the certainty of his own invincibility. According to the historian Jordanes, Attila died in the year 453 during his wedding feast with a young bride named Ildiko. After the celebrations, he drank heavily and retired to his tent with her. That night he suffered a massive hemorrhage, perhaps from a ruptured blood vessel in his nose, and suffocated in his own blood. At dawn, when his guards broke down the door, they found his lifeless body beside a trembling Ildiko. It was a sudden death, almost ordinary, when measured against a life that had shaken the course of history. Yet the story leaves behind many questions. Some sources suggest that Ildiko may have been forced into a plot of assassination, for the timing of Attila's death was too precise, just as he was preparing for another campaign against Rome. Others believe members of the Hun Confederation, fearful of his absolute grip, may have struck against him from within. No theory has ever been proven. It is the ambiguity itself that has made his end one of the enduring mysteries of the age. What is certain is that his passing sent a shockwave through the steppe. In a single night, the Huns lost their center of gravity, the symbol that bound them together. Attila was not merely their ruler, he was the soul of the empire. None of his sons could rise to fill his place. With his death, the fragile balance of the Hun alliance collapsed as well. Jordanes describes his funeral as extraordinary. Attila's body was placed within 3 coffins, one of iron, one of silver, and one of gold, before being buried in a secret location. Those who performed the burial were slain so that the grave would never be revealed. Whether fact or legend, the tale reflects the absolute reverence the Huns held for him. Attila's death was not just the loss of a leader, it was a sacred event, hidden forever in mystery. The sudden death of Attila was not only the end of a man, but the beginning of the dissolution of the entire Hun confederation. An empire of the steppe, held together by prestige and personal authority, lost its pillar overnight. Once Attila's cold gaze and iron hand were gone, the fragile ties between the tribes unraveled almost at once. Attila left behind many sons, Elak, Dengizic, Ernak, and others. But instead of inheriting power smoothly, they divided the realm, each seeking to claim authority for himself. On the steppe, where no fixed throne or codified succession existed, such division was an invitation to strife. None of the sons commanded the respect their father had, and their rivalry only weakened the union further. The eldest son, Elek, was at first recognized as the primary heir, taking command of the Hun core tribes. Yet his authority was quickly challenged. The subject peoples, who had followed Attila out of fear and for the promise of spoils, now saw no reason to obey. The Gepids, led by their king Ardaric, were the first to rise. Once loyal allies of Attila, they refused to remain under the rule of lesser heirs. The Battle of Nidau in 454 marked the turning point. In Central Europe, a coalition of Germanic tribes, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Rugi, Suebi, rose together against the Huns. In the bloody clash, Elak was slain, and the Hun army was crushed. Within a single year of Attila's death, the empire that had terrified Europe lay in ruins. His other sons struggled to hold on. Dengizic and Ernak maintained fragments of power along the lower Danube and the Pontic steppe, but they could not restore their father's dominance. Dengizic, in a desperate attempt, sent envoys to Constantinople proposing an alliance, but was rejected. In 469, he was killed in battle against the Eastern Romans, his severed head displayed on the gates of Constantinople as a grim declaration: the age of the Huns was over. Only Ernak, reportedly Attila's most beloved son, managed to keep a small group of Huns alive near the Black Sea. Yet this was no empire, only a wandering remnant amid the rising tides of Turkic, Slavic, and Bulgar peoples. From then on, the Huns faded from Europe's map, absorbed into new waves of migration. Their swift collapse revealed the true nature of Hun power. Attila's empire was not built upon enduring institutions or solid infrastructure, but upon the charisma and prestige of a single leader. When that figure was gone, the whole structure crumbled like a sandcastle swept away. Unlike Rome, whose decline still left behind law, cities, and faith, the Huns left little foundation for continuity once their leader was gone. And so, within just a few years of Attila's death, the Hun Empire that had once cast its shadow over all Europe disappeared from the stage of history. Yet in memory, in stories, and in legend, they endured. For sometimes an empire does not need to last long to become immortal, only to leave scars deep enough in the memory of humankind. The disappearance of the Huns did not close the chapter of the steppe. It merely opened the way for the next waves to come. From Asia into Europe, one nomadic tide after another rolled down, shaking the foundations of agricultural and urban civilizations. The Avars, Khazars, Pechenegs, Cumans, and at last the Mongols all followed a familiar script. First bands of horsemen spreading terror, then the formation of vast confederations, and finally either assimilation into settled worlds or collapse once their great leader was gone. The Huns under Attila were only one of the opening acts, but they served as a warning of a cycle that would repeat many times. The Eurasian steppe was a space unlike any other, stretching from the Hungarian plain through Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, all the way to Mongolia. A sea of grass without mountains or deserts to block it. Here the horse was the axis of life. People were born on horseback. They ate its meat, drank its milk, wore its hides, and above all, fought with it. That foundation created the mobility of nomadic peoples. They could appear without warning, strike swiftly, then vanish, leaving sedentary empires accustomed to slow, heavy wars, terrified. The Huns were the first to demonstrate this power in Europe. The Mongols would later perfect it. In the history of the steppe, two names stand as symbols of boundless strength: Attila and Genghis Khan. Though separated by 8 centuries, though born into different political worlds, they rise like twin waves, each swelling from the endless grasslands, each crashing down upon civilizations that once seemed untouchable. Attila struck Rome in its decline. Genghis Khan struck a fractured China, a chaotic Central Asia, and a divided Islamic world. What they shared was the legacy of the steppe: discipline, endurance, and mastery of cavalry. Under Attila, Hun horsemen stunned Rome with their mounted archery, turning in the saddle, feigning retreat, then firing backward as they wheeled to counterattack. Under Genghis Khan, such tactics became an art. He combined lightning mobility with signal systems and relay stations, transforming nomadic riders into something close to a war machine. Yet their differences decided their lasting impact. Attila's empire rested on his charisma and the distribution of spoils. When he died, the structure collapsed almost at once. Genghis Khan, by contrast, left behind a durable foundation: the Yasa law code, a decimal system of military organization, 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000, a network of relay stations, and a system of tribute and taxation. For that reason, even after his death, the Mongol Empire continued to expand, becoming the largest land empire in history. Their dealings with the settled world also diverged. Attila was a phantom of terror, aiming above all for gold, silk, and recognition. He never tried to restructure or absorb the Roman world. Genghis Khan and his successors, however, built an entire order, appointing governors, collecting taxes, securing trade routes, tolerating many religions to manage their empire. If Attila was a sudden storm that struck and faded, the Mongols were a long season of winds that reshaped the political climate of the continent. Even in memory, their images stand apart. Attila appears in European tradition as the Scourge of God, a symbol of divine punishment and haunting fear. Genghis Khan is remembered in more complex ways, as a unifier and state builder in China and Central Asia, and as an Eastern nightmare in Europe. One left behind the legend of fear, the other left both legend and lasting systems. Placed side by side, they reveal the rule of the steppe. Whenever sedentary empires grew old and fractured, the grasslands produced a leader who gathered the strength of cavalry and poured down like a flood. Attila and the Huns were the prologue, Genghis Khan and the Mongols were the climax. And though they differed in scale, both proved one truth: the steppe is never silent. It always holds the power to remind the settled world that no wall and no empire is ever safe forever. When Attila's name is invoked, the collective memory of Europe most often reduces him to a single word: destruction. He is remembered as the man who spread terror, the scourge of God who lashed the cities of Rome, the storm of the steppe that shook an entire continent. Yet if we step back and look more closely, that portrait is not so simple. Attila was not only a destroyer. In the way he organized, ruled, and negotiated, we also see the figure of a builder, someone who helped shape the political order of 5th century Europe. To begin, it cannot be denied that Attila was a symbol of ruin. His campaigns in the Balkans, Gaul and Italy left countless cities abandoned, villages erased, and populations scattered. The flattening of Aquileia, the burning of Metz on Easter, the refugees who fled into the marshes of Venice, all stand as living proof. For those who endured them, Attila seemed like nothing less than the herald of apocalypse. That memory nourished his image in epic tales, in legend, and in generations of fear. Yet if we stop there, we overlook the other side. Attila was not a mindless killer. He knew when to destroy to inspire dread, and when to spare in order to profit. Cities that opened their gates and paid tribute were often spared. Only the stubbornly defiant were reduced to ashes. This was not whim, but strategy, to use violence to enforce submission, while still leaving the chance of survival, so long as his order was accepted. More than that, Attila was a builder of order within the Huns themselves. He transformed a loose confederation of tribes into an empire bound by discipline and loyalty to a single center of power. Under his command, Hun forces were not mere wandering horsemen, but a coordinated army capable of standing toe-to-toe with Rome. Within his camp, he balanced the ambitions of tribal leaders, rewarding some, punishing others, to keep the whole from fragmenting. That was the skill of a politician as much as of a warrior. On the international stage, Attila revealed himself as a master negotiator. He signed treaties with Constantinople and Ravenna, demanded immense tribute, then redistributed it among his vassals. In doing so, he turned Rome itself into the treasury that sustained his empire. This was not destruction, but political invention, a model of harnessing the wealth of the enemy to feed one's own power. Even in his personal life, Attila's simplicity carried meaning. Sitting on a wooden chair, drinking from a plain cup, he was not merely austere, he was sending a message. The leader of the Huns did not need luxury to prove authority. That image itself built a new kind of symbol, standing in stark contrast to Roman emperors drowned in gold and ceremony. So the question, was Attila a destroyer or a builder, has no simple answer. He was both. He destroyed to create order. He spread fear to impose stability. In his hands, the steppe was not just the launching ground of raiders, but a true center of power, strong enough to force Rome to alter its behavior. Although the Hun Empire disintegrated almost immediately after Attila's death, his shadow never vanished. Instead, it continued to live on in the collective memory of Europe, not only in chronicles but in culture, literature, and legend. History remembered him as a fearsome warlord of the steppe, but culture transformed him into a figure of many faces, sometimes a demon of destruction, sometimes a majestic king, even at times a wise and just ruler. This multiplicity is what made Attila unique, a character who appeared again and again across centuries of Europe's imagination. In the Germanic epics, Attila emerges under the name Etzel. In the Nibelungenlied, the great medieval German masterpiece, he is not portrayed as a butcher, but as a wealthy and powerful king, pivotal in the tragic story of Kriemhild, who sought vengeance for her slain husband. In this tale, Attila is no monster, but a sovereign, dignified and at times almost sympathetic, caught in schemes beyond his control. This perspective shows how the Germanic peoples, once enemies on the battlefield, preserved the memory of Attila as a lordly figure rather than a barbarian. Later, the Hungarians, in shaping their own national identity, also laid claim to Attila. In their legends, he became a forefather, a symbol of steppe strength and ancestral pride. To Rome, he had been a scourge. To Hungary, he became a source of honor. This contrast reveals how historical memory is never a single line. One man may be destroyer to some and founding hero to others. On the other hand, medieval Christian culture cast him as the embodiment of divine punishment. Dante Alighieri, in his Divine Comedy, placed Attila in the circle of hell reserved for the violent, among other infamous figures. In Dante's imagination, Attila was a drinker of human blood, cursed for eternity. Here, he was no longer the historical man, but a moral symbol, a warning in the grand tapestry of Christian judgment. The stark contrast between Attila as Etzel in the Nibelungenlied and as a damned soul in Dante's Inferno demonstrates his many-sided image in European culture. He was both a noble king in Germanic memory and a bloody monster in Christian imagination. Neither portrait matched reality, but together they ensured his immortality in cultural memory. He was too potent a figure to be forgotten, embodying both fear and admiration at once. Across the folk traditions of Europe, his name became synonymous with devastation. Parents warned their children, "Behave, or Attila will come." Preachers invoked his raids as proof of divine judgment. Through such stories, his figure seeped deep into Europe's spiritual life, far beyond the borders of the battles he actually fought. Over the centuries, Attila became not only a historical character, but a mirror in which Europe reflected its fears, its pride, and its yearning for justice. He became a sign, an open symbol, interpreted differently by each culture and each age, and so though the Hun Empire lasted only a brief moment, Attila's name continued to resound, from the tragic verses of the Germanic epics to the fiery stanzas of Dante's Hell. As his shadow lived on in cultural memory, one truth emerged. Attila's true power did not lie only in his battles, but in his ability to transcend time itself, to become legend and symbol. And from there, his story leads us to a deeper question. How does collective memory transform a single human being into a symbol that exists beyond history? When Attila fell on that fateful night in 453, an era came to a close. Yet his disappearance was not simply the end of a man's life. It opened a silence, a deep fracture in history, where lessons about power, the fragility of empire, and the collective memory of humankind all intertwined. In the end, Attila vanished from the steppe like a whisper. No one knows where his grave lies, and no visible trace of the Hun Empire remains, but perhaps that very absence makes his presence all the more haunting. Like a ghost of history, he does not rest quietly in the earth, but lingers in Europe's imagination, in chronicles, in songs, and in shared nightmares. And as history closes that chapter, we still hear the distant echoes, the pounding of hooves, the clash of swords, and Attila's last whisper, reminding us that all power is finite, yet the shadow it casts can outlive time itself, falling across the generations that follow.